众朋友们好，欢迎大家来到今天的思想先驱报节目现场。在您看到这一次思想先驱报的时候啊，实际上与我们录制已经有一段时间了。那么我由于个人原因啊，要去芝加哥开一个跟中国经济相关的研讨会，因此呢，提前为大家准备了这一期节目。但是我们今天讨论的节目呀，时效性并不强。准确而言啊，这几个话题是我们一直关注的话题，所以希望等我们这一档节目为观众朋友们放送的时候啊，这个话题还没有过期。我们要讨论的是什么问题呢？就是中美关系啊，这个话题永远不过期。我们特别要为大家介绍到的呀，是荣鼎集团旗下的分析师司马乔丹先生，在他的话中国 China Talk 播客节目中，近期对于拜登总统的亚太沙皇坎贝尔先生的一个采访。而在今天节目的最后，我们还要为大家引述约瑟夫奈先生来自哈佛大学的一位专门研究国际关系的学者，在报业辛迪加集团下属刊物上所刊登的一篇评论文章。我们首先来说坎贝尔接受司马乔丹先生采访时所表述的一些观点。近期华为在 5G 领域实现了突破，让很多美国负责出口管制部门的人员也觉得摸不着头脑，到底华为的 5G 技术进入到什么情况了？之前美国对于中国新兴关键技术的限制是不是出了什么样的问题，出了什么样的漏洞呢？在这样的一期播客节目中司马乔丹先生首先就问及了坎贝尔先生，你的老板沙利文此前是宣布美国的目标是要在半导体、人工智能这样的关键新兴领域保持与中国尽可能大的差距和领先优势。结果你想保持差距，建起了小院高墙，华为却说现在他们已经在 5G 领域实现突破，重入终端市场了。这个政策是不是出了什么样的问题？这还是现在的政策吗？坎贝尔先生就提到说美国特别重视的是国家的全面实力，而在国家全面实力中的一个核心元素就是制定标准、创造市场份额和在关键技术方面提到最高水平创新的实力。因此坎贝尔先生就提出了一个概念，除了小院高墙的既定政策之外，美国还需要继续投资，并且继续发展自己的技术。那司马乔丹先生随即就问到说风险其实是两面的，美国在出口管制和其他限制方面过于严格，那可能会把自己的企业给毁掉；美国在这一些管制方面过于宽松，那可能会让战略先机被中国取得。因此怎么办这个问题到底你这个边界画在哪里是最优的？而坎贝尔先生也表示的确这是一个非常重要的问题，也是一个非常复杂的问题。但是坎贝尔先生也说他最担心的还是设置的过于宽松了，言外之意就是对于中国的封堵中间的漏洞仍然是他认为的核心关键所在。坎贝尔先生也表示说，但是除了这一点之外，现在我们的这个技术发展也在进入一个新时期。新的时期中不仅仅是计算本身、算力本身和能力很重要，能源所依赖于的供应来源也非常的重要。一个大的体系、最大的效率、整个供应链的韧性，所有这一些都在美国的考量范围之内。有的时候美国希望能够自主创新，有的时候却需要在整个系统和供应链中建立一些韧性。比如华为最近宣布可以制造7纳米的这样的一个芯片，那么美国之前对于华为的出口管制是不是就彻底失败了呢？坎贝尔先生没有直接回答这个问题，但是他说关键是我们现在希望能够抑制一些技术流入中国的安全和军事部门，不希望我们美国的技术帮助激活中国的一些能力。因此在对于中国这样一个非常具有挑战性的国家而言，这一些管制仍然是必备的。而更重要的是，美国自己的技术框架必须能够跑得更快，我们美国自己必须进行更加适当的投资，也要进行更加明智的投资。我们的盟友和伙伴，我们也希望他们能够和我们更加紧密的合作，并且我们也意识到盟友是美国全球领导地位的基本特征。那么有关于这个问题我想请问一下和平先生，坎贝尔先生实际上两方面都说到了 一方面认为对于中国的管制仍然是必要的，而且如果说现在的标准和理想的标准而言，坎贝尔先生还是认为还太过于松了，太过于松懈了。但是呢，坎贝尔先生也明确的意识到，这个技术的设置啊、限制标准过松和过严，其实都有相应的风险和相应的疏漏。因此，最终美国仍然必须自己跑得更快，要投资于美国自身的能力。这个话呀，当然说的没有错。但是美国到底应该怎样投资于自身的能力？美国现在在制造业出现严重中空的情况下，重新投资自己的产业链，还有没有重新抢夺回制造高地的机会？何明先生，
完全有。美国所具备的这个条件是中国所不具备的，而中国所具备的一些条件是美国不能具备的，所以在进行这个竞争的时候，不是采取简单的围堵，也不是采取简单的制裁和封锁，而是像坎贝尔先生讲的，真正的核心的一点就是美国要保持这个领先的地位。只有美国保持真正的领先地位，美国才会呢不可摧毁。就像你现在两个地方啊，在一条街上开两个餐馆啊，搞这个竞争，你不是就改善自己的服务品质，不是出更好的这个花样啊，或者是让大家吃得更好、更加欣赏，而是出来躲掉了一些呢跟这个对面的餐馆有关联的，比如说供货商比如说这个某些产品或者是某些器皿这种方式讲老实话是很难的。真正是你要有自己的独门绝技，真正有自己的真正的欣赏你的客户。美国在这方面过去2年采取的方式呢，小于高强也好，其他围堵也好，都说是比较传统或者说比较笨重的方式。不但要自己这样做到一点，而且要求盟友做到这一点。现在这个盟友是美国非常重要的一个基本特征，我是同意的。基本的价值观，美国有强大的力量去保护一些盟友。但是他有一点呢，就是说也应该知道，今天的这个世界是个全球互相关联的一个世界，不仅是你的盟友跟中国有很多的合作的关系，你自己也是避免不了这种合作的关系。也就是说，简单的去把对方采取这种隔离的围墙的战术，其实我认为这种呢是很难成功的。真正的成功是美国自己强大，美国自己领先，而美国有这样的能力，首先是人才更加的开放，鼓励支持帮助一些人才，而且是全球各地，而这一点中国是没有这个能力。第二个是采取更开放的体系，跟大学跟公司进行合作让这个产品，让这个设计，让这个创新呢，是中国在短期之内追不上。其实中国在长期的以来呢，也是这么看待美国的，但是很可惜，美国在这方面做的不是那么好。
那么说到这个问题我也想到了今天大家在我们这个简报系统中看到的一个消息，就是澳大利亚当局在过去的8年里面是进行了政府内部的3项单独的研究。研究的目标是什么呢？就是我们有没有可能从中国供应链中完全多样化。结果3个不同的研究现在得出的结论都是不可能从中国完全的多样化那么这个消息呢是在南华早报被报道，那我们一早的这个简报节目中已经为大家收罗了这样的一个消息。那我们看到澳大利亚一方面是和美国和英国有区域的奥库斯安全条款，同时在和中国处理贸易关系的时候呢，也非常的谨慎，因为澳大利亚很多的出口产品完全是依赖于中国的市场，又在印太地区这样一个关键的位置，所以对于澳大利亚而言，到底怎样看待中国，是历届政府都必须面对的一个敏感的问题。那么这一届这个澳大利亚政府和上一届莫里森政府有相当大的不同。那么呢，在一些关键的贸易领域，现在是似乎出现了回暖的迹象。但是根据来自南华早报的报道，澳大利亚政府其实也是非常的担心，就是我们是不是对于中国的依赖会对于澳大利亚本身的经济韧性造成伤害因此根据消息人士透露，澳大利亚的 DFAT 就相当于是澳大利亚的对外贸易部和对外关系部门，以及澳大利亚下属的财政部是联合对于这个供应链的韧性进行了一个评估。 那么整个这个评估过程啊，历时8年，从2015年就已经开始评估了，和中国脱钩到底有没有可能，从中国分散多样化去风险到底有没有可能。另外一次是在2020年重新又做了这样的一个评估，而不同的多项评估所得出的结论是一致的，就是第一，没有任何市场可以完全取代中国成为澳大利亚的商品出口市场。但是我们一提到整个市场的韧性啊，你完全依赖中国啊，中国占到太大的份额，似乎对于澳大利亚的国家安全也是一个危险。因此啊，这一些报告也表示说，虽然没有办法完全与中国脱离而形成贸易的多样性，但是呢，像东南亚地区的适当倾斜，就是我们所谓的中国+1这样的模式，可以帮助缓解澳大利亚的一些安全隐患。因此啊，在谈到美国到底应该如何处理与中国棘手关系的时候，我们也提到这一份报告啊。
抱歉，
你要讲。
我认为中国+1这种概念啊是试射一回，而且必定是失败的啊。原因非常简单，不是说不能要完全依赖中国，反过来讲，中国也是依赖世界。中国能够上市美国这么大的一个市场吗？中国能够上市欧洲的这种技术管理市场吗？没有。
何斌先生，我要先打断你一下，为什么？因为今天我们在节目的第2部分，约瑟夫奈教授所讲的正好是你的这个观点，就是为什么中美之间不是必须有一战。换句话说，而约瑟夫奈先生他的观点是更进一步，他认为中美之间不可能有一战。
对，
言外之意
也是我的观点。
就是大家这一种啊，我们在英文里面叫 hands and glove， 就是手套和手的这一种关系，它是没有办法解体和脱节的。他认为呢，正是这一种关系是维持和平最后的也是最稳固的堡垒，而不是某一个领袖对于世界格局的看法，
完全正确，
也不是中国和美国在地缘政治中间出现的这样的一些角力呀，还有暂时出现的摩擦呀，包括长久以来的竞争等等，都不是决定战争与和平真正的要素。所以我先打住何明先生，我们讲到约瑟夫奈教授的文章的时候，再详细讨论您的观点啊。
抱歉。
那么在这个坎贝尔先生在接受播客节目采访的时候啊，也被司马乔丹先生挖出了他的一段黑历史啊，是打上引号的。坎贝尔先生啊，在这个牛津读书的时候啊，曾经写过一篇毕业论文啊，不知道呢，这个司马乔丹先生是使尽了什么样的办法，还找到了他的这一篇毕业论文。这一篇毕业论文讲的是什么话题呢？这个话题其实我们的很多观众朋友们也可能非常感兴趣，就是意识形态，更准确的说是共产主义的意识形态到底是不是对于美国的生存性的威胁。坎贝尔先生的这个毕业论文啊，最后呢也是经过改造之后以一本书的形式出版。他当时研究的问题还不是中国，而是苏联和南非的关系的档案历史。在这样的一篇论文中坎贝尔先生就得出了一个观点，就是美国实际上可能过度强调了苏联对于南非还有整个非洲的意识形态影响，夸大了苏联的共产主义意识形态的输出性。那么当时呢，美国是接受了国民党方面的说法，认为一旦美国呢是在这个没有把苏联挡在第三世界或者呢现在叫全球南方之外，那么可能会导致整个共产主义意识形态在整个全球南方的扩张。那么这个晚期苏联的外交政策其实也让很多人联想到了今天的中国，这也是现在国际政策界大家讨论特别多的一个话题，就是中国在意识形态方面到底是不是对于美国构成了生存性的威胁。在被问及这个问题的时候呢，坎贝尔先生首先是开玩笑说你还能找到这本书不容易，这是世界上最畅销的书但其实那本书根本没有什么人卖坎贝尔先生当然是对自己的这个书的反讽。他讲到了一点说冷战时期的苏联和现在的中国如果比较的话呢，有一点像苹果和橘子一起比较，就是不是特别的有可比性。他说目前在中国的最高层，坎贝尔先生认为意识形态框架仍然是非常非常的重要的。中国的最高领导人往往仍然通过苏联历史、共产主义解体的历史通过这样的一种意识形态的透角和视镜来看待美国，包括美国是不是已经进入了资本主义的晚期时代等等等等。但是在坎贝尔先生看来，在那一篇文章中他所表达的一些观点现在呢仍然是适用的，就是有关于中国的意识形态，前苏联的意识形态到底有多大的输出性的特征。他认为呢，其实经常在国际话语讲 是被夸大理解了。这种意识形态在最高层间仍然存在，对于在国内经济管理的时候，或许仍然有他们的影子，但是对外输出意识形态现在似乎并不是中国的优先事项。而在谈及苏联和中国的区别的时候坎贝尔先生也讲到了一点，就是说有一个非常明显的不一样，就是在苏联时期的时候，其实苏联的军事理论家和他们的经济策略师非常清楚的明白，也认为在和美国相比的时候，自己的投资以及经济是落后的。但是他认为现在的中国领导人和整个的中国民众，他们并不认为自己的系统和美国相比是衰退的，他们有一种真正意义上的一种中国要重新回到这个时代，并且取得某一种先机，这样的一种抱负感和雄心。坎贝尔先生在接受采访时说说不仅仅是所谓的百年屈辱不仅仅是这一种屈辱感，也有一种力量感，就是他们有这样的一种预感，就是中国的时代已经到来了，而现在中国这样一种令人瞩目的能力和实力必须在全球舞台上得到发挥。当然了，在说意识形态特征的时候坎贝尔先生也讲到了比较微妙的一点，他说习近平和普京之间的某一种友谊也好，两个人的某一种惺惺相惜也好，的确是有一点意识形态的底色的。他说尽管我们严格来说，普京已经不能算是共产主义的领导人了，他也不是一个意识形态上共产主义国家的领导人，但是呢，不管是习近平也好，还是普京也好，他们其实都是从苏联这个时代走来的人，而苏联的解体又成为了他们个人的国家的历史创伤的一部分。那么到底为什么普京和习近平会形成这样的某一种默契，或者是某一种能够觉得相互理解呢？坎贝尔先生指出就是习近平的父亲习仲勋先生与苏联的影响，显然对于习近平本身的成长过程有这样的一些影响。那么同时呢，习近平自己也经常表示对于苏联的这个情感，对于苏联文学作品的热爱等等等等。但是在整个的这个从大势来看，很难说中国现在走出的是一条意识形态扩张、意识形态国际化的这样一条把共产主义红旗插遍全世界的道路。而在前苏联的某一些时期那么的确苏联是具有这样的一些国际雄心的，但是在苏联晚期的时候，在美国的主流政策界其实对于苏联在国际上的特别是全球南方的野心和扩张力量也存在高估这样的一个特征。那么坎贝尔先生这个评估和明先生是不是正确？
我非常再加几个非常都可以非常佩服这种洞察力这种掌握的程度和我所了解的是非常接近的。意识形态是中国今天令人厌恶的一个话语系统，但是这套意识形态在中国领导人看起来是使他们体制或者是国家不至于崩溃的一个理论基础。如果丧失了这个理论基础，中国的合法性和中国政府的这种合法性就丧失了。所以呢，他们把这一个明明大家都不喜欢的这个理论体系变成他们今天的执政的一个基础，反复的强调，因为不提它就什么都崩溃了。这是第一点。第二点是，这个理论对于他们来讲也不完全是虚幻的，因为包含到20世纪很多人的一些理想，只是这种呢以悲剧收场。那么习近平希望通过他的改造，能够把西方的优势给拉到或者学到，然后再加上马克思主义的这种所谓的理论的价值，在中国建立一个比西方更公平的、更有效率的这么一个国家，这是他们的一套话语系统。但是坎贝尔先生说，这套价值系统失去还遥远的很呢，因为看失去我们可以看一看中国的大外宣达到了什么效果，它到底是怎么一个布局的，中国的孔子学院是怎么布局的，中共和国际社会的交往是不是有浓厚的意识形态。从这几个方向来讲，中共今天意识形态的对外输出还不如呢几十年以前毛泽东时代还真有这种想法。所以那个时候对南美、对非洲、在东南亚 还真有一些意识形态的输出。现在的中共的这个中共中央联络部做的不是大卫性工作，做的是党级的一种交往合作关系，乃至于党的这个外交部和当年的这种对外合作输出意识形态是不一样的。所以我很佩服。
那么说到这一本书本来呢是相当有洞见的一本书，但是卖的怎么样呢？是不怎么样出了一版之后就没有再出第二版。那么在这个
就不错
在这个播客节目中司马乔丹先生打趣我看你这个书大家评价是10颗星里面大概是6.5到7颗星左右就一般般，不是特别好。坎贝尔先生也开了个玩笑，说我这个书前几年突然有一个人跟我打电话，说一个英国的一个什么机构给这个书颁了一个奖说你写的那个苏维埃对于南非政策获得了一个大奖，恭喜你。然后坎贝尔说，我接电话想了半天没就记不起来这本书到底写的是什么了。然后呢，主持人和坎贝尔先生也都哈哈大笑对于这样的一本学术著作，可惜畅销效果似乎并不好，进行了这样的一个玩笑。不过说到读书司马乔丹先生又问了坎贝尔先生一个问题，就是说你如果能够让习近平读一本书，你会让他读什么样的书？这个时候坎贝尔先生又讲到了他对于现在中共内部信息系统的一些理解。他说据他所了解到的情况，就是习近平获得信息还有从哪里获得信息，现在的来源越来越有限。在现在中国的这个权力系统中很少有人能说真话了。他说说这一点倒是让我想到了毛泽东时期某一种历史的重复，就是只有某一种类型的干部或者是某一种类型的信息能够达到权力的最顶峰，而这确实让我们美国非常的担心。因为不管中国和美国之间的关系如何走，我们希望我们在中国的这个对手方习近平能够对于整个世界有一个全面的深入的了解，就是他不要生活在自己的信息茧房中。他说说现在我们担忧的是什么呢？就是中国的国际事务的算计，中国的决策制定已经让人觉得有一些担忧了，就是他们到底是基于什么样的信息做出的这样的一个决定。因此回答你的问题，我觉得我可能希望习近平有一个普通的图书馆的卡，他可以进去看到各种各样的书，也会看到和他从他的下属和工作人员里面那里收到的完美的玫瑰色的信息有冲突和矛盾的一些其他的情况。他讲到说这个习近平现在只有一种信息能够达到顶端了，而这样的一种信息闭塞的情况下，可能导致他对于整个世界局势的理解，甚至一些政策都已经出现了我们说失真这样的一个趋势。美国是不是希望习近平成为孤家寡人呢？如果是按照坎贝尔先生的话说，实际上并不是这样。美国希望和自己打交道的是一个对于国际事务有全面掌握的一个对手方。那对于坎贝尔先生的这样的评价，何明先生你觉得怎么看？
我认为坎贝尔先生讲的也是非常的正确，也是我们现在非常担忧的一点。中国的这个信息系统在今天中国这种民智已经开放或者是半开放的情况之下，能够办得如此的无聊几乎每一个中国的媒体都是一份奉天时报。所以我就开玩笑说，如果习近平要当皇帝他不需要他的习明泽或者他女儿或者其他人再去编造一份奉天时报，每一份都是奉天时报，跟人民跟社会跟国际社会的真实的情况不仅是相差很远，而且是沉默的扭曲沉默的掩盖沉默的就是古板所以我不知道中共的意识形态怎么堕落到这样一种程度。这是第一习近平如果在中国的官方的媒体里面是看不到真正有卓越见解，看不到有真实的中国情况和国际情况的这样一个媒体。第二个是中国的内参，在毛泽东的时候，中国的内参不仅是他掌握信息的一个来源，也是他权力的一部分。那些所谓的他判出来的这些人，其实就是毛泽东的特派员。毛泽东的特派员跟省委、市委和军委或者是各个系统之间有时候是有一些距离的，甚至那些当地的或者掌握权力的人都比较害怕，甚至有时候不知道是谁。 毛泽东通过这样一种方式呢，掌握了一部分的情况。而习近平今天所面对的情况是，这些所谓的写内参的人已经成为既得利益的一部分，他们到地方上已经是跟地方的利益不要说是私营企业这些利益，而是跟当地的党政军混为一体，因为他们在当地已经有了办公楼，有了住家，有了各种各样的利益，所以他们去写他们的这个问题可能性就本来就很低。这种情况从江泽民时候就慢慢开始了，到了习近平时候呢，大家还有一条，就是说我写这个内参，我要揣摩上意，如果你上面不是这个意思，我写这个内参不但达不到内参的效果，甚至可能我很糟糕。不但我很糟糕，甚至我的上司就不会把这个内参发表出来。所以呢，现在所谓的内参也是风听时报。那习近平靠什么了解情况呢？那么一方面是他的经验他是从底层，也是红二代那么很多的这样的人生的阅历他有自己所积累的这种经验和判断力。第二个是通过内部的会议来讨论很多的问题，那还是比较真实的。那个会议呢，让他了解一些情况，要他完全不了解情况除非他真的就是一个人像老毛一样的，旁边就几个女人那可能是的。但是习近平不是这样的，他还是要到国际社会来，他还是要参加各种各样的会议。我认为他完全不了解情况是不大可能的，但是这种情况会越来越恶化，这是可能的。
好，谢谢这个何明先生的介绍那么今天有关于坎贝尔先生这个采访我们在节目结束之后也会为大家进行完整的呈现两位主持人除了谈到我们谈到的这一些重要的话题之外，还有很多互相打趣这样的一些情况。为什么这个采访我非常的喜欢呢？就是因为很多现任的政府官员在接受媒体采访的时候，往往重复的是一些政府的官方的论调但是呢，司马乔丹先生和坎贝尔先生两位是老朋友有的时候呢，反而说话可以更加随意的一些。但是年纪其实相差很大。你不能透露坎贝尔先生年龄有多大司马乔丹先生可能就是我这个年纪
对呀，
是这样的一个情形。但是如果我没有记错的话，应该是两人在新美国国家安全中心。这个是非常重要的一个政策智库有民主党外交政策黄埔军校之称。坎贝尔先生也是主要的创立者之一应该是司马乔丹先生在这个部门工作的时候两个人认识，当然这一点我也不是特别的清楚好，说完了坎贝尔先生的这一段采访，今天再为大家推荐的是在报业新迪加发表的
还要介绍一本书，能不能把这本书变成下一期
是约瑟夫奈先生的一篇文章我们今天简要开一个头那么或许呢更多的内容我们再来介绍。其实近期的书特别多，裴敏信先生还新出版了一本书，但是要等到2024年才能出版那我们也联系到了这个出版社，那出版社也是希望我们等这个书已经开始进入发售和推销包括运行这个阶段的时候再在节目中对于裴敏信先生的书籍内容进行更多的介绍。但是呢，我也会在第一时间获得这一本书的稿件为大家提前阅读。说到约瑟夫奈先生的这一篇文章我们就要说到一个经常提到的一个话题，就是从历史中汲取经验教训这个历史是我们的这个前人前车之鉴等等等等。但是约瑟夫奈先生就提出了一个相反的看法，就是说美国和中国避免热战和冷战其实没有你们想象的那么难。美国只要做好2点就可以了，第一，对自身进行投资；第二，避免不必要的挑衅。只要做好这一些其实美国就可以大大降低与中国陷入冷战或者是热战的可能性。但是美国真正需要做的是什么呢？就是要放弃那些耳熟能详但是却充满了误导性的历史类比故事。大家一提到美国和中国经常会说美国和中国大国竞争将是本世纪上半叶国际关系的决定性特征。如何定性这样的竞争呢？有人说是这个生存性的竞争，有人说是持久的竞争，等等等等。有人想到的是上个世纪2次世界大战期间的德国和英国之间的竞争。有人担心美国和中国是公元前5世纪的斯巴达和雅典之间的竞争，注定必有一战。但这里呢没有点名，实际上批评的是约瑟夫奈教授的另外一位同事就是同在哈佛大学肯尼迪政府学院的艾里森教授。到底是不是这样呢？在约瑟夫奈教授看来，什么持久的竞争冷战必有一战这一些都是极具误导性的术语。仔细来看， 就在中国共产党1949年执政以来，中美关系经历了很多的阶段。50年代的朝鲜半岛是相互打仗残杀，70年代进行了尼克松访华历史性的访问，之后两国又合作制衡苏联了。90年代之后，美国支持中国加入世贸组织之后，两国之间的经济往来是越来越热络，对于中国和美国的经济关系以及经济繁荣都是非常重要的贡献。2016年开始，大家突然开始提到大国竞争了，好像说到中国的时候，就变成是唯一能够在经济、技术、政治和军事上对于美国形成系统性挑战的国家。但是说我们看到历史啊，就在过去的几十年里，中国和美国之间的相互关系、相互实力都已经经历了这么多次的转变。我们现在怎么能说未来我们一定长期处于冷战、长期处于热战呢？他说呀，说美国的确面临从中国来的真正的挑战，但是啊，这两个国家在经济、社会和生态方面相互依存的状态，是历史上任何两个国家的大国关系都没有见到过的。美国根本不可能贸易投资与中国脱钩，当然了，你要是脱钩也可以，但是你必须就吃下这个苦果的另外一半，就是给自己造成严重的巨大损失，给全球也造成严重的巨大损失。再来说到中国，中国是不是美国的世代威胁呢？至少美国和盟国面临的威胁跟什么共产主义意识形态的传播没有什么关系。经济政治上，你可以说中国与美国之间存在着这样或者是那样的问题，但是什么安全问题上的脱钩啊和去风险化，局部而言可能有一些合理性，有一些这样的一些可能性、可操作性，但是完全的经济脱钩成本根本高的不可想象。即使是美国最亲密的盟友也不会效仿美国这样做，更多的国家即使是美国的盟友也会把中国视为最重要的市场和贸易伙伴。同时，两个国家的相互依存也不仅仅是在经济和政治方面，气候变化、大流行病的威胁、跨国问题以及跨双边问题，所有这些问题不管是好是坏，中国与美国都处于一种合作竞争这样的一种生态状况中，这和冷战时期的遏制是完全不同的。美国是不是可能对于联盟体系形成主导作用呢？现在仍然是，但是即使是在美国最亲密的联盟体系中，不管是日本，美国的盟友，还是印度，现在是美国最重要的在印太的伙伴，都缺乏中国的一些重要的资产。全球的经济中心在上个世纪就已经从欧洲转移到亚洲了，但是国际关系的复杂局势在过去这几十年里丝毫没有简单化的特征。有人说说这个发展中国家是不是有一些团结性啊？中国是不是要成为全球南方的霸主啊？他说这完全是陈词滥调，而且非常具有误导性，因为这些国家内部也存在着非常激烈的竞争。西方民主盟国的财富总和还要远远超过于盟国，美国也根本不必担心什么中国能够引领全球南方变成是美国以及美国体系之外的另外一个霸主。美国有很多的国内问题，但是共产主义的意识形态对于美国是没有丝毫吸引力的。说中国是生存性的威胁，只有一种可能下，这个生存性的威胁是真实的，就是中国和美国真的是陷入了一场大规模的战争，真打起来了，那中国就是对于美国生存性的危机。因此这个约瑟夫奈教授就警惕我们对于一些似是而非的历史类比要特别的谨慎。现在中国和美国之间不是1945年1945年大战前夕的欧洲，也不是冷战前夕的欧洲。尼克松和毛泽东在1972年会面的时候，实际上真正的智慧之处正是因为打破了一些历史的条条框框。美国维持现状是维持非常珍贵的和平，独立的挑衅行为反而是可能让中国成为美国生存性威胁真正的自我实现的预言。和平共处是最大可能的情况，并不是什么小概率事件、必有一战的说法，其实只是对于历史的某一种夸张式的延伸。那么对于约瑟夫奈先生的这一篇文章那么题目就非常的怎么说呢， 非常的挑衅性啊。格兰·艾里森先生的这本书叫做《Destined for War》，就是注定一战。而约瑟夫·奈先生的这一篇文章啊，叫做没有什么注定一战，不是注定一战。言外之意啊，就是说中国和美国之间其实最大概率仍然是以和平共处、合作共赢、合作竞争啊。同时在某一些方面又不断出现各种各样的挫折摩擦，不断在各自的地缘政治盟友之间啊你争我抢，经济上又互联互通，这样的一种系统化的生存形态。那对于约瑟夫·奈教授这一篇文章，今天我们只是简要开一个头啊。我想先请何明先生谈一谈他的看法，未来有时间在思想先驱报我们再详细介绍。
如果看过点点经呢，是的，观众都很清楚啊，他这个里面所讲的所有的点我都全部讲过啊。但是呢，人家讲的更有条理，人家讲的更有水底，更重要的是人家有专业的身份。我只是一个媒体人，但是我们的观点啊，基本上啊就差不多。冷战之后啊，或者是冷战前后吧，我具体是这样讲，美国有3大误导世界的巨著，第一本啊是文明的冲突啊，第2本是个笑话啊，叫历史的终结啊，但是这个读者呢还不甘心于失败啊，就像另外一个整天预测中国崩溃一样的，还是在全世界啊这么讲来讲去啊，中国没有崩溃，他自己也不能崩溃啊。那么第3本书啊，就是这个修昔底德陷阱，修昔底德陷阱呢，这些书啊，恰恰对中国知识分子这3本书还影响蛮大。所以中国的知识群里面啊，被这3本书误导是非常强的。正是因为误导很强，所以我就看到了一些中国人自己对中国的评价，对世界的评价都已经走了样，所以他们后来变成进入了美国的极端的这么一种话语系统，也是不奇怪的。中美之间不但不能脱钩甚至出风险，也是个似是而非的说法。什么这个中国加1这也是一种想当然，因为从本质来讲两国这个已经是不可分割现在大家只是看到美国对中国的依赖，西方对中国的依赖，没有看到中国这个把美国看得依赖到什么程度。你去问问中国的年轻人，如果他们出国留学，是不是首选的还是美国？你去看看中国的移民，如果他真的符合条件，美国的移民体系不是那么复杂官僚，那么他们首选的是不是美国？你去看看这个中国人如果说他要到跟美国或者全世界的企业进行合作，他是不是对于他来讲首选的是美国？你去看看中国的生产的厂商，他们要出口，是不是最好的目标是不是首选这个美国？无论从哪个程度来讲，今天美国的政治对中国的影响，生活对中国的影响，消费品对中国的影响，科学创新对中国的影响，甚至呢像无聊的，在我看起来很搞笑的好莱坞那些电影，也是中国人最欣赏的。连习近平都喜欢那些看那些什么大片了，在我看起来很多大片就是烂片。但是呢，可见你就告诉我，那相比之下，你看看美国人对中国的依赖有什么呢？那差得太远了，完全不是的一个层次。中美之间的竞争也好，世界的发展也好，美国的优势是不可取代的不仅仅是10年、20年，甚至30、40年之后，中国哪怕是主导了某一些技术的这种产业的主导权，我认为那个时候简单的用东升西降的这种方式来描述美国，看到今天美国的政治的某些混乱，看到美国的社会的某些问题，看到美国的这个法治的一些缺失这个抢劫杀人这个强奸等等等等。但是整体来讲，美国在全世界的没有任何一个国家在未来几十年之内50年吧，或者是不太长了，30年是看不到天的这个国家。中国也不是，那印度更不是。那反过来讲，中国谁可以取代它？是印尼吗？是马来西亚吗？是菲律宾吗？是越南吗？是印度吗？是南非吗？是巴西吗？是阿根廷吗？是土耳其吗？是沙特吗？ 是 A 级吗？全世界就那么几个国家，大家可以数得出来的。但是很多这种事实 A 的说法，他们不仅是没有做量化的研究，你起码的常识都没有，起码掌握信息的能力都没有。你看，就随便找一个历史的例子，随便找一个想当然的意识形态来去描述中国，这些人啊，不仅是他们浅薄，而是误导了大家。而误导了大家的最大的恶，就是刚才讲的这3本书。而今天终于有了这么一篇文章来讲出真相。真相就是中美之间的依赖。从依赖的程度来讲，那中国更依赖美国。从依赖的程度来讲不可能把中国的依赖搞成一个什么中国加1，你告诉我加那部分能够让你有没有风险吗？那是不可能的。所以这种想当然的这个事情呢，应该回到最基本面，中美之间不可能有什么真正的冷战，更不可能有什么这个热战。不冷不热就是口水是战，那是可能的。互相讲一讲，互相省一省讲一些不太好听的话，那是可能。但是真正做起来，我相信双方都形成一个强大的力量。这种力量不仅是来自于政客本身，也来自于经济领域，来自于科技领域，来自于社会各个阶层已经是密不可分。就算是有些政客想把它极端化，实际上这种都很难。
好，谢谢何明先生的介绍那么我们也知道思想先驱报这一档栏目的定位就是要离新闻稍微远一点，离思想稍微近一点。有的时候新闻和思想是在2个不同的端口那么在今天的节目中呢，我为大家介绍了坎贝尔先生在华中国播客栏目中接受采访，对于中美关系以及对于习近平的信息系统所表达的一些观点，也为大家介绍了哈佛大学的约瑟夫奈教授在报业辛迪加集团的一篇观点文章，对于他的同事艾里森教授的中美必有一战的理论提出了一些不同的看法。那如果您喜欢了解到美国的政策界、思想界以及学界对于中国中美关系最新研究的话呢，除了我们的思想先驱报之外在华尔街电视还有一档栏目叫做华尔街智库。我们会在第一时间对于智库、对于中国、亚洲、美洲以及大家关注的各大问题的研讨进行汇总，以原汁原味的形式呈现给大家。如果您有特别推荐的行业报告、智库讨论以及其他的一些学术会议的相关资源的话呢，我们也请您推荐给我们，由我们的编辑进行质量审查之后，也会选择在华尔街智库栏目为大家进行播出。以上就是本期思想先驱报的全部内容，我是主持人乐子李琦，感谢和平先生做客思想先驱报，下周同一时间我们再会。
It's very hard to convey the depth of horror and pain that I, my family, and my country have experienced over the last few days. The last time so many Jews were killed in one day was the Holocaust. We are devastated. We are torn to pieces. I personally am torn to pieces. And we are hearing more and more stories of utter deprivation carried out by Hamas against children, against mothers, against grandmothers, soldiers. An entire base of women who worked in intelligence was mowed down. A bunch of 20-year-old girls. My daughter was in a base just like that 3 years ago. And she said to me, "Mom, that could have been me. We were not prepared for having a physical attack. None of us were trained to shoot. We had nothing." So they were just sitting ducks because Israel never expected this kind of invasion. we have no strategic depth in Israel. When I would host Chinese experts, Chinese policy advisors, government officials, etc., in Israel, I would take them around the country and have them walk to the border and see we have no strategic depth. The minute you cross our border, we are there. There's no buffer zone. So Israel has worked religiously to keep the violence and the attacks on our country on the other side. And this was a failure. This was a straight out failure. And we have gone from Saturday morning shock the entire day, just feeling like you're getting punched in the stomach over and over and over. And then we got past that first day, and now we're told we need to prepare our safe room for a potential attack by Hezbollah in the north with 150,000 missiles pointed at us. And some of these are precision missiles, and they will, it's not a hole in the building like you might have seen in Tel Aviv or part of a house. This is a complete wipeout if it comes from the north. And in this case, there's expectation that there will be hundreds of thousands of casualties. So we are preparing our safe room, and we're told we have to put cash. And, you assume water and dry goods, that's what they said, but also cash and your ID. I mean, I guess so that your ID doesn't get destroyed. So afterwards, if you can walk out of there, we can know who you are, or they'll know who you were when they pull you out of the, I don't know. I really don't know. It's so hard to fathom. We're just not completely prepared. Although I do have to say we're not unprepared. I do remember that over the past few years, sort of during COVID, we were reminded by the military that we need to do this kind of preparation. We will need to do it. And here the day has come. So where am I? I'm preparing the safe room. I'm trying to focus on work. I'm trying to help my kids who are all adults, but still suffering through this. And they in turn, are doing volunteer work to try to help anyone that they can in order to get through this in one piece and hopefully come out of it stronger and with a very new Middle East.
So let's talk about the sort of, I guess, Chinese interpretation of the events over the weekend, which apparently are like America's fault. I'm curious for your sort of diagnosis of, what were some sort of geostrategic drivers of the attacks.
Well, the Chinese interpretation, first of all, I've been in touch with scores of government and party policy advisors, experts, academics over the last few days, and every single one of them on a one-on-one basis has offered heartfelt support, standing with Israel, supporting the people, etc. The government has interpreted this. It comes across in a very similar way to the way China has interpreted past terror attacks. And it is bizarre to say, but, even we woke up and said, oh, it's another terror. Is it another terror attack? And, oh no, this is not just another terror attack. I mean, can you believe those words that I'm saying? That terror attacks are our norm. Oh, yeah, it's just another terror attack. So China's response has always been generally to take the Palestinian side. Politically, China officially stands 100% with the Palestinians and has done so, for decades. On an economic level, China is very happy to work with Israel on a personal level, on a cultural level, many interactions, academic cooperation, scientific cooperation, et cetera, et cetera. But politically, they've always been very clear. 100% anti-Israel votes in every international institution. When I said this on CGTN, I was criticized by a Chinese scholar that this was too harsh, that I was too sharp. And my response is, this is not the time for concern about Israeli harshness and sharpness. This is a time where history will judge the decisions that are made by countries around the world. And we see, Brussels generally is not a great supporter of Israel. It generally is a critic of Israel, but they firmly stand with Israel right now. The butchery that took place, no humane person could watch that and say that this is anything but barbaric, and stand with the people who are suffering. Many Chinese people, I understand, are getting a lot of misinformation and disinformation, which is common. But it means that the government and the censorship is allowing that misinformation to become rampant on and Weibo and other social media, which is causing a misreading, and it's making it look like, once again, the Palestinians are suffering from Israeli aggression. Well, this began with the most egregious and savage, barbaric behavior against citizens, civilians. And the next step is very much that Israel is going to have to respond. And I ask the Chinese leadership, if a country near China entered across the border and murdered an equal percentage of people and captured an equal percentage of people, of Chinese, and took them into their territory as hostages, what would China do? China, we have seen China's response to any kind of modest, and I will say modest terror. There is terror and there is terror. A car bomb in Tiananmen totally transformed China's approach. And what we've experienced, what Israel has experienced throughout the years has been horrific, but it doesn't compare to what we went through on Saturday, which is Simchat Torah. It's a day of joy. The holiday happens to be my birthday. And instead, this day will always be associated with tragedy, and a tragedy of enormous proportions. So China's interpretation is very much seen through the lens, from what I can tell, of the standard competition with the United States, the fear of U.S. strength and its ability to cultivate strong alliances. And therefore, that rhetoric is guiding the interpretation of what has happened here. And that is in itself tragic, because it will lead China to miscalculations on policy steps in this region. The Middle East, we all know, has become very important to China. It has actually accurately identified the Middle East as sort of the weak link between Europe and the Indo-Pacific. China has focused very much on investment in the Middle East, bringing Middle East countries into its orbit. We know that 4 of the 6 countries that were brought into BRICS are Middle East countries, including Saudi Arabia and Iran, which is, I believe, part of the wind in Iran's sails was becoming more of a recognized player on the international stage. I also think that the U.S. Releasing at least $6 billion to Iran, which is fungible, even if that money is only for humanitarian, and frees up a lot of other money for Iran to use to back Hamas. We know that Hamas had many delegations visit Iran over the past many months, and it's clearly training, guidance, and masterminding of Iran behind this attack. Hamas was backed by Iran and guided by Iran, and when we look to who is at the core of this, it is a country that is working closely with China. And China is aware of Iran's threats to eviscerate Israel. And the first statement that Xi Jinping comes out with is to create an answer to this attack. A Palestinian state must be created alongside a Jewish state. And I want to ask, what in this event on Saturday indicates that there is an interest in a Palestinian state alongside a Jewish state? There is nothing in that attack that would lead to a kind of compromise. And anybody who thinks that that was an effort for anything less than the entire territory of Israel is kidding themselves. First of all, Hamas does not represent the Palestinian people or the Palestinian Authority. Hamas has been running its own territory for years. There was no reason for them to be interested in Israel at all. But their goal and their charter states they will take the entire land and turn it into an Islamic state. And that is what the murderous efforts that took place on Saturday are meant to lead toward. Iran has orchestrated a multi-level, multifaceted plan where it starts with Hamas, draws Israel on foot into Gaza, and at that point, there's an agreement that Hezbollah will begin to attack from the north, while we have many of our military capabilities focused on the west in Gaza. At that time, there are also Iranian militias made up of Taliban and Houthis in Iraq and Syria who can infiltrate from the north. They can then open up two more fronts, which is the Palestinians in Judea and Samaria, which some people refer to as the West Bank. And the final front are Israeli Arabs. And we saw some of that take place in the recent past. But in the end, this 4 or 5 point attack is not about convincing Israel to make concessions. If Israel thought that concessions would lead to a peace and a live and let live situation, we would have done it years ago. Ehud Barak offered Arafat, with the support of Clinton, more than 100% of the territory that has been discussed in these two-state solutions for decades. And he said no, flat out no. He said, I will not be the Arab leader who gives away our sacred land. Well, what sacred land is he talking about if he was already getting 100% of the territory discussed?
Let's take a step back and talk a little bit about the sort of China's moves in the Middle East over the past year or two. You've seen a lot of coverage of them sort of husbanding this rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which looks a little interesting in retrospect. But I'm curious sort of what you think the broader motivation was for all of that and where China will stand, when the dust starts to settle on whatever is going to happen over the next few months.
So first of all, we have to keep in mind what we said at the outset, or what you noted so rightly, that it looks like it's all about America from the perspective of China. So as I noted, the Middle East is this weak link. China has been the largest investor in the Middle East since 2016. The digital Silk Road has been very successful here. The investment by China into Middle East countries that can provide payment through oil, etc., has grown exponentially. I think the third largest BRI investment country a couple of years ago was Iraq, because they can pay for whatever they need in oil. We know that there's a huge amount of Chinese technology. Huawei has blanketed most of the Middle East except Israel. They don't have the same, the Arab countries don't have the same security concerns that Israel has with respect to privacy, with respect to control over their telecoms, For us, it's existential. For the Arabs, it's just another thing. So they also believe that they can balance the two, balance the U.S. off of China and vice versa. We've seen very clearly Saudi Arabia and UAE's ability to get benefits from both sides, and especially Saudi Arabia playing one off the other quite successfully, because Saudi Arabia has a lot to offer. It has a lot of money and oil resources. So it's in a very different position. And having Saudi Arabia in China's camp is a major goal. Pulling it away from the U.S. is an anchor for China's position here. When Xi Jinping came out with the Global Security Initiative, Wang Yi, the top diplomatic official of the country, said this will become the security architecture of the Middle East. Specifically said that. Now, prior to COVID, there were yearly gatherings hosted by China between Israelis and Palestinian talks, but they were all with non-official players, which didn't really lead to much, except China got a little bit of pro-propaganda that they were helping the Palestinian cause. Of late, they, after the success with the Saudi-Iran rapprochement, where they invested a few months of effort, where the Qataris and the, maybe it was Oman, who had done the heavy lifting along with Iraq. But China came in towards the end, definitely made a contribution. And that success far outweighed their expectations. They did not realize that they were going to get so much play from that achievement. And it led them to pick up the phone for the first time ever to have the foreign minister back then, before when Qin Gang was still in his role, called up the Israeli foreign minister and the foreign minister of the Palestinian Authority and said, we're happy to mediate and bring this problem into the United Nations. And of course, it's well known that Israel is despised in the United Nations, never gets a fair shake, and bringing anything about Israel into the United Nations is anathema for Israel and equal to failure. Nonetheless, China made that offer. I think China's interest is establishing the Global Security Initiative, which is also a non-starter for Israel, with the concept of indivisible security, where the security needs are equated for us between the Palestinians and the Israelis. It doesn't speak to the problem where we are the subject of Palestinian terror on a permanent, ongoing basis. Yes, the media in China portrays it as Israel being the aggressor, but in fact, we are the victims of terror over and over and over. And the reason we have to have all of these checkpoints, et cetera, is because we keep getting blown up. So my understanding of the end game here right now, China, on the one hand, has its goals. It wants to sideline the U.S., keep Saudi Arabia in its orbit, strengthen the axis of countries that are under the sort of China umbrella of, quote, global South countries, and have some of these stronger countries like Saudi Arabia in that camp. However, after this terrible failure on the part of Israel, and there are reasons, there are many reasons unknown, but there are a couple of reasons that are known, and they're not good. One of the reasons I think that Israel let down its guard is because Hamas had been behaving incrementally more like a responsible actor. And Israel wanted to believe the fantasy, like everyone else, that there's hope for peace, hope for progress, and let down its guard. And that, along with the infighting that we had over the last 9 months, distracted too many people. And for that, and as well as other reasons that will come out later, we were, we dropped the ball. Our security people dropped the ball. And that's over. Israel has regrouped. We and the rest of the world are now aware of who we are dealing with. And there is no possibility when you live next to a monster, you have two choices. The monster eats you or you kill it. And those are it's a terrible thing, but you can't live next to a monster who's constantly coming and trying to destroy you. So that will happen. And if Hezbollah decides to join in, I don't know. When the U.S. battleship pulled into the Mediterranean, it was a very strong message, not only to Hezbollah of what they might expect, because Americans were killed and Americans were probably kidnapped and taken hostage, which gives America the ability to get involved should that be useful. But it also speaks to Saudi Arabia and the other countries of the region that if you're like Israel or you are working with Israel, you have an opportunity to gain the kind of security umbrella that Israel has. And that, in my opinion, you want to talk about where is the Middle East going. I see a new Middle East that none of us could have predicted on its way, where we have this war, we reshape the immediate neighborhood based on the results of that war, that normalization follows with Saudi Arabia, that other Arab countries see the benefits and join in. And at that point, China will have to rethink its approach to Israel, because until now, Israel was a very useful card. If you throw Israel under the bus, and China doesn't like to hear it, but it's the truth. If you throw Israel under the bus, the idea was you're going to get support of the 56 Muslim states, and certainly the 22 in the Arab League. And if many countries in the Arab League are normalized with Israel, working with Israel, changing their views of Israel, you can't do that anymore. Now you're going to have to work with Israel to gain the support of those countries. And that, in turn, throws a bit of a stick in the spokes of the Iran-China relationship.
Anything you want to leave our Chinese, American, European, global listenership with?
Yeah, I do want to mention that one aspect of this conflict that is not being mentioned, but is an underlying critical factor, is the civil war within Islam that is basically Iran versus Saudi Arabia, Sunni versus Shia, where Iran is looking to establish an Islamist, more extremist leadership and take the global Muslim population into a more extremist direction. And Saudi Arabia and Morocco are working towards a more moderate Islam. And this is being played out right now. We're in the crosshairs, as usual, we, Israel. We're on the front lines. And how this ends up is going to impact many, many parts of the world. And I think people need to be aware and support Israel's efforts, not only because we were butchered, but also because we're on the front lines working for a world order of stability and of moderation that I think is desired by most countries.
Carice, thanks for being a part of China Talk.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Ophir Dayan works at the Institute for National Security Studies based in Tel Aviv. She's a China Middle East policy analyst, also recording the AM Eastern Time, Tuesday, October 10th. Ophir, talk us through your past few days.
So if I had to choose one word to describe what Israel and Israelis have been experiencing over the last 3 and a little more than 3 days, is surreal. I think that things that unfolded on the ground are scenarios that Israelis didn't think possible. It's, in a way, the worst nightmare of Israelis. I think the past three days were, for Israelis, a wake-up call. We've seen hundreds, almost 1,000 Israelis killed. We've seen, I assume, what to be over 100 Israelis, including civilians and children and the elderly, kidnapped into Gaza. I think it's important to understand how sure Israel was in the strength of its army and in the weakness of Hamas in comparison, and how there is a misconception. There was a huge misconception about the power balance here, and I think many Israelis, including myself, are even now, more than 3 days after this war broke, a bit in disbelief of what's been happening. And again, I'm going to use the word surreal. We've seen sites, they're very graphic, so I'm not going to repeat them here, but we never thought we're going to see this sort of fighting taking place inside Israel. We never thought we'd see the sheer number of people kidnapped and murdered by Hamas. And I'm going to say one more thing, which I think it's very important to understand here. We've seen ISIS-styled acts by Hamas, and I think that also is a very important aspect in terms of, first of all, the people killed and abused, but also the psyche, the national psyche. I think that we've it adds to the shock and the trauma that we've been experiencing, and since it's taken place in 2023. Everything is recorded, everything is on social media, and people are exposed to it. And lastly, I'm going to say that only the sheer number of people missing, the people murdered, means that every single Israeli knows at least one, if not more, of someone who is directly impacted by the fighting, whether it be a murdered individual, a hostage being held in Gaza, someone missing, and I think that's it's a big turning point for Israeli society and for myself in how we view ourselves and our enemies in this region, both in terms of their strength and in terms of their brutality.
Ophir, well, let's tease that out a little bit. What's the sort of before and after? I mean, it is a terrorist organization. They have been bombing Israelis for a long time now. But sort of what about the kind of ISIS, inspired dimension, as well as the scale, sort of changes, how the government and how the people sort of interpret their, the broader security environment.
So I'm going to say something that's it's going to be very sad, but for the past 18 years, Israelis got used to being bombarded by Hamas, by rockets, by water shells. We just got used to it. And it's no longer something that is completely shocking or destabilizing to us. We are used to having this mini conflict with Hamas once every few years. But this one is different. I think what makes it different is the surprise. We woke up Saturday morning, 6:30 a.m. Israel time, with uncertainty of what's even happening on Israeli territory. Entire communities were held by Hamas. They were taken over by a terrorist organization. And this surprise of something we never thought possible, and the way that it took the Israeli Defense Forces and the police many, many hours to intervene, I think that's different from other times. But I think what makes it very different than other times, which is, I think, the most destabilizing thing, is that we are used to, I don't want to say sterile warfare, but to bombs and aircraft. In response, we're not used to them infiltrating Israeli territory in this scale, taking, more than 100 Israelis, civilians, hostages, and killing almost 1,000 Israelis.
What's your sense of the sort of Ophir, why don't you give a little background of China-Israel relations, as well as what what China has been pursuing over the past few years in the broader Middle East?
Okay, so I'm gonna start this way. Diplomatic relations between China and Israel has only been a thing since the 90s. So even the broader context of Israeli-China relations is pretty recent in terms of international relations. The relationship between China and Israel is based a lot on economic and trade relations. China is viewed here in Israel as an economic partner, not as a strategic partner in the same way the U.S. is perceived here in Israel. Yet, I'm going to say it this way. Look, even though China is perceived here as a trade partner more than a strategic one, people here like China. They value China. People here travel to China. They buy Chinese products. Before this entire thing started, we even were talking about a planned trip by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to China, a trip that stirred controversy because, Netanyahu and his closest compatriots even floated around this idea of China, of this trip being a realignment in the Israeli alliances system, a little more towards China than the U.S. And we need to understand the context that this is coming from. People view China very differently than people in the U.S. view China. While people in the U.S. view China as competition, as a threat, in Israel, China is an inspiration. We look at how, China builds magnificent structures and huge projects, and here in Israel as well, by the way. So that's how Israelis view China. And I think in this context, it was very disappointing for many Israelis to see the Chinese response, especially compared to the American response and to other Western nations. While President Joe Biden unequivocally supports Israel, gave several statements, is sending, Navy vessels here, sending military assistance. China couldn't even bring itself to properly denounce Hamas, something that is very basic. And even people as anti-Israel as Ilhan Omar, the Congress member for the U.S., she even condemned Hamas more than China. And no Israeli thought Ilhan Omar would be a better ally of Israel than China. I think that's a bit surreal to see Ilhan Omar saying that she's horrified by the crimes Hamas is committing, and China saying they hope for all sides to remain calm. I think that's a bit surreal for us. This entire idea is magnified by the fact that there is a Chinese citizen, at least one, directly affected by the fighting, and a citizen called Noah. She's a young Israeli, Chinese Israeli being held in Gaza. Her mom is Chinese. And there was a very viral video of her being kidnapped into Gaza. She has been kidnapped by Hamas. And first of all, if I might say, she's a very beautiful young lady, which, when you look at it, it's just sad. She's there surrounded by Hamas terrorists, and she's saying, please don't kill me. And it's been on the cover of many international news outlets, many newspapers, and China, where she's a citizen, has been, their response was rather disappointing.
So I'm sorry. I think we know her mother is a citizen. I'm not sure she's like a passport holder. Is that confirmed here, or what's the dynamic there?
I think as far as the reports here goes, she's a Chinese citizen. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it's tricky because you can't, China doesn't
recognize
dual
citizenship. So she's not recognized by China as a citizen because she has dual citizenship. Which again is a concept that is very foreign to Israelis, because there are many Israelis with dual citizenship, so they don't understand why in this case it's not something that prompts reaction.
Gotcha. Ophir, let's take a step back then and talk about China's broader ambitions in the Middle East. We saw them being very proud of brokering this deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. We'll see where that leaves. We'll see where that ends up after the dust settles from this war. But what is the relationship that China particularly has been trying to develop with Iran? How is that seen now following an attack of the magnitude like this?
Look, I must be completely honest with you. I think Israelis are less engaged in the China discussion here in the Middle East. This is something that we, people who monitor China very closely, this is something that is very disturbing to us. The average Israeli, I'm not sure even knows or takes account of China's actions here in the Middle East. But I would say though that every interaction between a foreign government and Iran is seen as very negative here in Israel, especially by a government like China, a country that Israelis consider as a friend. I think that while the tension between the US and China is very evident and very understood by analysts here in Israel, the average Israeli is less aware of it. And they view China as a friendly country. So it's lack of ability to condemn Hamas properly, and more than that, its alignment with Iran is seen very negatively here, and they will be viewed even more negatively when Israelis will be more aware of this connection.
So let me read you this tweet. I'm curious for your response. Ryan Haas from Brookings tweeted, "Time will tell, but my expectation is that China's cautious response to Hamas's attack in Israel will expose the limits of PRC influence in the region. Beijing historically has been wary of being drawn into taking sides. I don't expect that to change." Thoughts or response to that sentiment of here?
I think that's a very good analysis of what's been happening. While the United States is extremely involved in what's happening over the last little more than three days, China is not as involved. Rhetorically, by not being able to condemn Hamas like other nations did, but also on the ground, I want to remind our listeners that a few years back, China even proposed to mediate between Israel and the Palestinians. Again, it did the same, I think, last year as well. And those are attempts that Israelis are aware of. They know that China views itself as some sort of a potential mediator in the never-ending Middle Eastern conflict. Even a survey that was conducted a few months ago with young Arabs in the Middle East, showed that they prefer China to the U.S. as a mediator. But in times like this, a country that views itself as a possible mediator should be more involved and not, sit on the sidelines and say, bad people on both sides. And that's practically what China has been doing so far. I think China is also showing its lack of nuance of what's been happening here. The sides here are not even, especially when you ask Israelis. And China kind of makes this comparison. And while the United States is sending military assistance, which is, again, very, very unusual, it also shows solidarity on other levels. The White House was colored blue and white as the Eiffel Tower and the Brandenburg Gate in Germany. We don't see that solidarity from China. But I think it's important to understand how, Europeans and Americans are also very familiar to Israelis. They travel here. And although there are many Chinese tourists in Israel, Israelis know less about Chinese culture. They know less Chinese individuals. So even on the human level and on social media, they interact less with Chinese people than they interact with Americans or with Europeans and other English-speaking countries. So, so China is, I would say, cautiously unfelt here by Israelis, and I would even say by Israeli leadership.
Yeah. There's sort of the context, I guess, of like ISIS style exposure, I think, which China and the Chinese, people as well as Chinese leadership really hasn't had. I mean, in terms of terrorist attacks, right? We've had some knife stuff and a threatened car bomb, which has kind of been it over the past 15 years. And I think that's very different than, in European, bombings and killings across Europe, as well as in the U.S. and in the Middle East, where America had troops in Iraq and Afghanistan for years and years. So I think there's sort of the comparisons are maybe easier to draw, given the proximity of sort of similar experience, I guess.
And I think it's important also to note that in terms of values, there is more similarity between the values on which Israel is built upon and American and Western values. It's easier for democratic countries like the U.S. and the U.K. understand how it is felt by Israelis when a non-democratic society is in conflict with a democratic society, which is something that is not shared by China.
What's a kind of interesting parallel that was pointed out by your colleague Tuvia Gehring, who couldn't join us today because he was called up, is the sort of echo that you're seeing in China's response to the Russia-Ukraine fight and the way it's portrayed on official media to how they're talking about Hamas's attacks and Israel's response, where you basically have this this narrative of the devastation caused in this case by over the past year by Ukraine, in this case by Israel, sort of no real context on like why those things are happening. And then, one or two sort of nods, or maybe not even a nod. It was sort of incredible, I thought, in Siwen Lianbo, how they didn't even mention the fact that, hundreds of Israeli civilians were killed, which is why, you saw those, you saw the images in the first half of the sort of little clip of attacks in Gaza happening in the first place. And then you kind of close it with by the way, this is actually all America's fault because, they're the bad actors. So it is sort of like a surreal playbook it's surreal, but like, I guess kind of understandable given that she has this relationship with Putin and sees them as a strategic ally, but to sort of, in a sense, put Putin's a superpower or sort of superpower in Russia on the same level as Hamas is just a wild thing to see happening in real time.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely agree with that.